about building layouts. And so before we actually start doing that, let's talk about what layout actually means and also the three major ways in which we can build layouts in CSS right now. So in web design and web development, when we say layout, what we mean is basically the way that text, images, and all the other content is placed and arranged on the web page. So here on the right side, I have an example of a very simple website, and there are a couple of pieces of content, and clearly they are arranged in a certain way, right? And so again, the way in which they are arranged and placed here on this website is the layout of the design, essentially. So the layout gives this page what we call a visual structure, and then into that structure we can place the content. Now, one of the main jobs as front-end developers, so as HTML, CSS, and JavaScript developers, is to build layouts, which is the reason why we have an entire section on building layouts alone. So according to this definition of layout, building a layout means to arrange page elements into some kind of visual structure instead of simply having all of our elements, so all of our content, basically placed one after another. Just imagine that in this example website, all these 7 pieces of content would simply be laid out one after the other. That wouldn't look very interesting visually, right? And it also would make a lot harder to actually understand the content that is being transmitted here. So layout exists for a reason, because it makes our sites easier to understand and also makes it visually more pleasing. Now, there are basically 2 types of layouts, which are page layout and component layout. So page layout is basically what I've been talking about up until this point, which is laying out the elements, so the big pieces of content inside of a web page or a website. Now, on the other hand, these bigger page layouts are themselves made of components like this one. And these components themselves need to have some kind of layout, because these components themselves are made out of smaller pieces of content which also need to be arranged in some kind of way. And so we can say that components themselves also have a layout. So once again, we wouldn't want to have these 12 pieces of content simply laid out one after another, right? That wouldn't make a lot of sense. And so therefore, we also need to give these smaller components some kind of layout. Okay, so now that we know what layouts are and what type of layouts we can build, now let's see how we can actually build them with CSS. And the first technique of building layouts in CSS is using float layouts, which is basically the old way of building layouts using the float CSS property. Now, these types of layouts are quickly getting replaced by newer technologies such as Flexbox and CSS Grid, but in some cases they are still being used, and especially on older websites. So we will still learn how to build float layouts, just so you know how they work in case you ever see one at some point in your career, for example when you're working on an older website. But for the main part, we will then quickly move on to one of the newer ways of building layouts, which is using Flexbox. So Flexbox is one of the modern ways of laying out elements, and in the case of Flexbox, it is perfect for building one-dimensional layouts. So basically a layout which is just a row, and all without using floats. So Flexbox might be perfect for simpler component layouts, just like we saw in the last slide. Then the other modern way of laying out elements is CSS Grid. So with CSS Grid, we can actually build complete 2-dimensional layouts, which is perfect for big page layouts and also more complex components like the one that we saw in the last slide. So Flexbox and CSS Grid have completely revolutionized the way in which we build layouts in CSS right now. And so we will spend most of the course learning them and using them in our big website project later. But for now, let's actually start quickly learning float layout. First, we need to understand how the float property actually works. So that is going to be the goal of this lecture. So in this section, we will keep working on our blog post page from the Code magazine. And we will use each of the 3 methods of building layouts to create a layout like this. So at this point, you see that the header here, which has the heading and the navigation, now occupies basically the entire page from left to right. We have the heading and navigation side by side. And then here below, we actually have now these related posts as a sidebar. So we have this content here on the left side and the sidebar on the right side, both below this complete header. And then down here in the end, we have this footer, which again goes from left to right. Now here it has this weird color, but we're going to fix that, of course, later. But what matters is that this is the kind of very simple layout that we will build using float layouts, Flexbox, and CSS grid. Okay, but for now, in order to get started with this section, I will create new starter files here on my desktop. So since we are building on the previous section, I will simply go ahead and copy this folder and basically duplicate it here. And we'll then rename it to CSS layouts. But once again, just like in the previous section, you actually don't need to do this if you don't want to. So if you want, you can simply keep working in the same files, so in the same project folder that you have been using up until this point. So that's no problem. I'm just doing this so that later in the end, I have it all nicely organized so I can provide you with the final and initial files for each of the sections. Okay, but anyway, let's go back to Visual Studio Code. And then here I like to right click to create a new window, then open folder on the desktop. This is the one that I want. Okay, and in the meantime, actually my VS Code has updated, so it now looks a little bit different, but that is of course not important. So what matters here is that our files are exactly as we left them before. So let's open up the relevant ones, close the sidebar, and then let's go back to our live connection. So I click again on Go Live, and so here is that page back. So again, this is exactly how we left it before, and so this is going to be the starting point for now. Okay, so let's go here to the very bottom of our page. So here we are now starting to learn about floats. So I will create like a small section here in our CSS. And in order to actually start learning about floats, let's look here at this piece of our page. So what if we actually wanted these 2 elements here to appear side by side? So right now they are not side by side, because remember that this here is a paragraph element, which is by default a block level element. And so therefore it occupies its own line. So it created a line break before and after its element. Now we could fix that by making this paragraph an inline or an inline block element, but let's now actually explore another way, which is using floats. So let's give each of these 2 here a class name in our HTML so that we can easily select them. So this one actually already has the ID of author. As I mentioned before, I prefer to always use classes. And so I'm also giving it the class of author, and here the class of, let's say, author image. Okay. And let's also add the style or the selector for the author already. Okay, and now let's use the float property, and in this case we are going to set it to left. But here you can see a couple of different options for float, and mainly we can use left, right, or none. So let's use left. And with this, what is going to happen is that this image is basically going to be taken out of the document's flow, just like an absolutely positioned element. Now the difference here with floats is that then all the other elements will basically float around it. So let's give it a save and see what happens. And so here is the result of creating that flow. So as I said, this element here is now basically flowing around this one. And if I added a lot more text, then that would become even more visible. Let's actually do that. So here, let's add some more text. And there is a nice trick in VS Code, which is if you start typing lorem, so L-O-R-M, then you can hit enter. And this will then basically create a bunch of fake text, which we also call blind text. So let's save that. And so now it becomes even more visible how this text now basically floats around this image here, right? So this was just a test. Let's put it back to what it was. And now let's try to add some space here between these elements. So just so we see a little bit better what float actually does. Because now if we set like a padding left to move it, let's say 10 pixels, then nothing actually happened. So let's inspect this. And so you see here in this overlay, let's make it a bit more obvious. So here we can very clearly see that the element itself actually does not start right here where this text is, but it does in fact start right behind the image. And so that's why adding like these 10 pixels of padding, which is actually marked in green if you look closely there on the left, doesn't change a lot. Well, actually it doesn't change anything. So let's put a bit more here, like 50, and still nothing changed because the element is still behind the image. So we would have to add a lot more, let's say like 80 pixels. And only now it is finally enough to start moving out behind that image. So here we could again confirm that this image has been taken completely out of the page's flow. It is as if the image isn't even on the page, right? It does not really affect the surrounding elements. Now let's just, before we continue, add some padding on the top here as well. Let's say 10 pixels. All right. And now let me show you how we can actually fix the fact that this P element basically starts right at the beginning of the container, so behind the image. So what we can do is to float this element as well. So let's also float it on the left. And so now let's check that out again. And now the element starts right after the floated image. All right. So this all looks a bit weird, probably, and it sounds a bit weird, but this is just how floats work. Okay. We could also set it to right here, and then it would move all the way to the right side of the container. So just like this. But once again, we now actually have more modern ways of doing all of this, and in particular Flexbox and CSS Grid. But still, I believe that it's important that you get the basic knowledge about how floats work. Okay, so let's put it back to left. And now here, let's take this out. And let's simply add some margin to the left. Because now that is going to be possible again. Okay. And so now this looks nicely laid out. So it's as if this was a very, very small component layout right here. Now, in order to create some space here between this image, so basically this part here and the image, how could we do that? Well, let's try to add some margin bottom to this image just to see what happens. So margin bottom of 20 pixels. And so you see that a floated element is still able to create some margins around it. All right. So actually here we should also use margin and not padding, right? Because what we want is basically space outside of the element. Let's just move this here down. And in order to do that, I actually used a nice shortcut. So that is here in selection, which is this one. So move line up or move line down, which in my case is Alt or Option arrow key down. So this is an extremely handy shortcut that I actually use all the time in order to move some code around. So again, I can just hit Option up or Option down to move it up and down like this. All right. So this is the basic functionality of float, which is kind of weird, but let's make it even weirder and now add some floats to our elements here. So to this H1 and to this navigation here. Now we could do that in the elements that we already selected. So H1 here and then here in the nav, but actually let's select them again because later on I will then want to get rid of this new code when we leave floats behind. Okay, and selecting these elements again and again is of course not a problem. So we can just select them multiple times and then all of the properties will simply be applied. So what I want to do here is have this float to the left side and then the nav to the right side. So the goal is basically to have them both on the same line and have each of them float to one side. Because that will then create an interesting phenomena that I want to explain you. So float right, and let's see what happens. Well, this is not what I was expecting because the nav is not all the way to the right. So let's debug this here a little bit. And oh, well, in this case, it's actually very simple. Here it is not H2, of course. So I was distracted. It is instead nav. Okay. And now it's more on the right side. And if we open up, well, actually it doesn't change anything for now. But what matters is that this here is now floated to the right side and this one to the left side. Now, the interesting thing that's happening and that I wanted to show you is if you notice this gray background here, and maybe we can make it a bit more obvious. So this header, let's change this here quickly to red. And so now what we can see here is that this element kind of lost its height. So it looks very weird. In fact, the only reason why it is still visible is because we have some padding here. So if we remove the padding, then this element would disappear completely. So at least the background color behind it. So why is this happening? Well, the reason is that all of its child elements, which are in this case only two, right? So the header only has two child elements, the H1 and the nav, and right now all of them are floated. This means that it's as if these elements would not even be on the page. So as if they had been removed. And so now the element basically has no content anymore. And so that way it makes sense that its height is actually 0. So again, the height is now as if it was 0. The only remaining space that is remaining is because of the padding. And if we come down here to the box model, we can see that. So the width is still 720, but the height is indeed 0. And it's only this padding of 20 pixels on both sides that is still making this element visible. But otherwise, the background color would completely disappear. So exactly what happens if we put this here, the first one, to 0, right? So this phenomena is what we call the collapsing element. And when this happens, we say that the element's height has collapsed. And again, this did happen because both of its children are now floated. So it's as if they were not on the page anymore. Now, of course, we do not want that, right? So we still want this element here to have the height that it had before. And we can actually fix that, which is exactly what we will do in the next lecture. But for now, just to finish, let's quickly review how floats work and compare them to absolute positioning. Now, floats are actually not a positioning scheme like absolute positioning, but they are still another way in which elements can be out of flow. And so it actually makes sense to compare it with absolute positioning. So we can achieve a floating element by using float left or float right, just as we learned before. And as I was just saying, when an element is floated, it is removed out of the normal flow. And so in this regard, it is exactly the same as with absolute positioning. Now, what's different about floats is that floated elements do still have an impact on surrounding elements. So text and inline elements will actually wrap around the floated element. And so again, in this regard, floated elements are completely different from absolutely positioned elements, which have no impact and are also not impacted by any of the surrounding elements. Finally, one important characteristic of floats is that the container element will simply not adjust its height to the floated element. And so this is exactly the reason why in the last example that we just saw, we saw that that container element collapsed its height. All right, so I hope this quick overview and comparison will make it easier for you to understand floats. And so in the next lecture, as I was saying, we will now fix that problem of collapsing heights. We learn how to clear floats. So in the last lecture, we created the problem that this red main header element here collapsed its height, which remember was because all of its child elements are right now floated. Okay? And so in order to fix that, we need to now clear those floats. And the easiest way of doing that, which is not the best way, but it is the easiest one, is to simply add another element here to the header and then clear the floats from there. So let's add a div here with the class of clear, and the name here doesn't really matter. Okay, and this element, let's keep it empty because we do not want any content in here, right? So if we give it a save, then nothing changed for now, which again is because now these two elements are floated and this one here is empty, and so it also doesn't have any effect. If we added some content here, then you see that it improved the situation a little bit. But of course, this is not what we want. So to visualize this, let's actually permanently give the main header some other color. And the way I do that is by simply declaring another one here afterwards. So the original one was this one, and then I can just write another one later, and so this one will overwrite the first one. So this way, later I can simply delete this entire line. Okay, but anyway, what I want to do now is to, of course, select that element that we just created here. So this one with the clear class. So select it like this, and then here we can use the clear property. And so on clear, we can use also left, right, and both. Now, if we only wanted to clear left floats, then here we can say clear left, and the same with right. But in this case, we have a left float and a right float, and so we want to clear both of them, and so we use both. And if we now save this, then our problem is indeed fixed. Great. Now, back in the day, we used to build all our layouts using float properties like this. So imagine now that we had a row and in there we had 4 columns. So we needed one element for each of these columns and we had them floated all side by side. Then in that situation, the height of the row, so of the parent element of the 4 columns, would collapse. And so then we would have to go in and create an empty div element like that in each of those situations. So that could happen like 10 or 20 times on a page. And so that would not be useful at all, right? And also, we didn't want to clutter up our HTML with all these empty divs. So that's just a bad practice. So let's actually remove this here and take a look at another technique that we can use. Now, before I'm doing that, just keep again in mind that building float layouts is kind of outdated. And so you do not need to understand 100% how all of this works, especially with the clear. But again, I find it important that you have at least some idea of how this works, and especially of this trick that I'm going to show you now, which is called the clear fix hack. So the clear fix hack is something that has been widely used for many, many years in the CSS community. And the reason for that is exactly to avoid having these kind of empty divs, just like I explained here before. So that's not good, and therefore someone came up with the clear fix hack. So the way that it works is that on the element that has the collapsed height, so in this case here on this header, we add a class which was usually called clearFix. So just like this. Okay, so we added the clearFix class there, and then here in the CSS, we selected that, and then we used a pseudo element, and in particular, the after pseudo element. And remember that what this one does is to basically create a new element which will be the last child element of the container. And so in a way, doing this is exactly the same as adding this empty div here manually, right? Because again, what this after pseudo element will do is to insert a brand new element at the very end of the container, which in this case is this header element. So this one here, because now we added the clearFix class to that element as well. And so now we can clear the floats on this one. So clear both. But now remember 2 particularities about the after pseudo element. So first of all, it only appears if we define something for the content property. Remember that? So in content, there needs to be something, even if it's just like empty text. And so this is enough. And then also by default, pseudo elements like after and before are inline elements. However, clearing floats like this only really works on a block level element. And so we set the display property on this element to block. And so with this, the problem should now be fixed as well. And indeed, there you go. So let's check that out quickly. And so here is that pseudo element that we just created. And so now the floats are being cleared here. So if we were to take this off, then you see that the heights are back to being collapsed. Okay, and that's it. So this is how we would clear floats in float layouts. So again, by using this clearFix class, which back in the day was being used all the time, and we called this the clearFix hack. All right, and so now next up, let's use this knowledge to build a very simple float layout in order to make our page look like this. So like the final demo that I have right here. Okay, so we can easily do that with floats, and so let's check it out now. We have a basic knowledge of how floats and clearing floats works. Let's build a simple layout for our page. And so what we're looking for is this. So again, here we have a site finally as a sidebar here on the right side and our main content on the left side. Then we still have the header on the top spanning from one side to the other, and the same down here for the footer. All right, and you also notice that the container is now a lot larger. So we will do all of that, but let's identify the main parts of our layout. So that's the header here, which we already have nicely in place here. Then it is this article, this aside, and the footer down here, right? So let's start by selecting those elements here in our code again. And so I will select them here again for the same reasons as I explained before, which is because later on I will want to delete this code or to deactivate it, and then it wouldn't be good to have these properties in the selectors that we already have up there. So selecting the article, the aside, and the footer. And the header is not really necessary because we already have a lot of work done on it. Okay. Now here, let's quickly get rid of this comment. And now the first thing I'm actually going to do is to work on the container. And in particular, to make it 1200 pixels wide. And this will be the same for all the layouts. So no matter if building it with Float, Flexbox, or CSS Grid. And so I'm doing that up here. All right. And we can also remove this color here again. And so that's a lot better. And so now let's get to work and basically putting this article here on the left side and the aside on the right side. And to visualize this a little bit better, whenever I do something like this, I always give these elements some background color to make it easier to see the boxes on our page. So background color like this. And you see I'm starting more and more to use the VS Code autocomplete function because at some point we know these properties by heart, and then there's not really a need to keep writing them by hand. So the colors here don't really matter, just so we can actually see what is happening. And so now let's get to work. So we already know how float works, so this shouldn't be too hard. However, before using floats, we actually need to change the width of these two elements that we want to be side by side. So article and aside. So right now, each of them, since they are block elements, occupy 100% of the available width of the container, right? And so again, if we want them to be side by side, each of them needs to have a certain width. So our container is 1200 pixels wide. And so let's divide that up for the article and the aside. So I'm going to give the article a width of 900 of those pixels, and the remaining 300 go to the sidebar. So to this aside. And so 900 plus 300 are exactly the 1200 of the container, right? So that looks like this. And now all there's left to do is to put them side by side. So float left, and then here float right. And actually here we could use both. Okay, and here you go. Now they are nicely side by side. But now notice what happened here with the footer. So the footer is now floating around these two elements as well, because, well, that is exactly what the float property does. It makes it so that the elements that come after it will float around that first element. So here we have first this article, then the aside, and afterwards comes the footer. And so if we set the aside to float, then the element that comes after it will float around it. Okay, so that's just how floats work, which are, again, quite confusing. And that is exactly the reason why later on we will replace floats with CSS Grid and Flexbox. But anyway, if we want this footer here to be back down where we want it to be down here, then we need to clear the float. Okay? However, in this situation, actually we don't need to create any new empty div, or we don't need to use the clearfix class, because we already have that element on which we want to clear the float, right? Which is exactly the footer. Okay? So again, we needed to create an empty div before, or to use the clearfix class, because there was simply no other element on which we could clear the floats. But now there is. So it is this next element which we do not want to float around the other ones. Okay, so let's simply say clear both. So usually don't bother with clear left or right. If you say both, then it's just going to work no matter what. And so now you see it's gone, and it is back down here where it actually belongs. Okay. Now, just quickly about what I said, that in this situation, it doesn't really matter if we used float right or left on the aside. And the reason for that is that there is no empty space between them anyway. So in this case, it doesn't matter. But actually, let's create some space between them. And in this case, using margin or padding is probably not the best approach. So instead, what I will do is to simply decrease the size of this article element here. And so that will then essentially create a gap between the both of these elements. So let's decrease this by 75 pixels. So it will then end up with just 825. And so now there appears this gap, because this element is floated to the left and this to the right. And so then, of course, if we have some remaining space, it will simply stay here in the middle of the two. Now, if we set this one to left, now in this situation, that would not be ideal, because now the empty space would then be here on the right side. So let's put it back, and we can also get rid of the background colors. And with that, we actually finished the layout already. So this is already exactly what it looks like in the demo version, right? Great. So this is how we built a very simple float layout using floats, as I was just saying. Now, again, these are a bit hard to understand and to work with, and that's why the people who work on CSS came up with these modern solutions such as Flexbox and CSS Grid. And we will talk about them very soon, but for now we need to quickly learn about something else, which is to finally change the box model from the default behavior to something that makes more sense. So let's do that in the next video.